Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. This is part 4 of the second edition of Early Muslim Expansion, Arab Conquest of Iran and Egypt. Last episode, we saw the Rashiduns, or the Islamic individuals. We saw them take over the Levant. We saw them pretty much start to push back the Sassanids even more. Just look at all this territory. They've crossed the Euphrates. They pretty much have crossed the Tigris in some places as well. We saw that crazy dust storm that kind of took them for a ride, it seems like, the Sassanids, and they lost. They got routed because of a dust storm and strategy. So yeah, this is episode 4. I'm glad you're here with me. Hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already. We're going to continue Early Muslim Expansion, Arab Conquest of Iran and Egypt. Lego!
Garrison fled in the direction of Hulwan, and the town itself fell in December 637. Shortly after, Kaka rode in pursuit of the retreating enemy and defeated them, first at Kenikin, before besieging and capturing Hulwan in January 638. Emperor Yazdegerd retreated beyond the Zagros. When Kaka subsequently wrote to the Caliph asking permission to operate deeper in Persia, Umar would have absolutely none of it.
Why? Is he afraid that it's too far, too thin, and there's more important stuff in the Levant?
Forbidding the operation, he replied, "I wish that between the Suad and the hills were a wall, which would prevent them from getting to us and prevent us from getting to them. The fertile Suad is sufficient for us, and I prefer the safety of the Muslims to the spoils of war."
Well, at least we know that he's not just a conqueror, and he has some... I guess, like, this goes to show that the Umar is not he's not trying to conquer the entire world.
Expansion to the east was halted, but the Muslims were now looking towards the jewel in the Roman imperial crown, Egypt. Despite winning all of Syria and Iraq for Islam in a series of stunning victories, the Caliphate's military situation remained unstable. Fierce Persian resistance continued in the mountains to the northeast, while Emperor Heraclius was hindering the Muslim advance as much as he could.
And he's all the way back in Constantinople at this point, so he's going to have to rely on a lot of his generals across his empire.
To stall for time, while he created an impenetrable dead zone between the Anatolian plain and enemy-occupied Syria, Heraclius sent envoys to his Christian Arab allies in the Jazira area, requesting that they attack the Muslim army in Syria. They obeyed the emperor's orders, crossing the Euphrates and arriving outside Emesa in March 638, where Abu Ubaidah had concentrated his forces to meet them. However, Umar, in his typically hands-on fashion, reacted to this news by sending orders to Sa'd in Persia for 3 columns to invade Jazira from Iraq. When this group of Muslim warriors launched their attack and began plundering, the Christian Arabs retreated. In the aftermath, forces under Sa'd turned and annexed Jazira completely.
So basically baited and switched them to tire them out. We saw this at the very beginning, the very first campaign, at the beginning of the Euphrates down there at Umada, or was it Ubala? My bad, not Umada, Ubala. But yeah.
At the same time, multiple mounted raiding parties were sent by Abu Ubaidah into Roman lands. Khalid, the commander of one of these contingents, captured Marash in autumn 638 and hauled vast quantities of loot back to his base at Kinasrin. However, Khalid wasn't a man accustomed to hoarding wealth, routinely distributing his personal share of battle spoils to others. On one occasion, after his raid on Heraclius' lands, an Arab chief and excellent poet, Ashaz bin Qais, recited a beautiful piece for Khalid, and in return was given 10,000 dirhams. Unknown to the poet's benefactor, this act of generosity was in fact to herald the end of his peerless military career. Caliph Umar had been concerned about Khalid for years by 638, specifically that his personal brilliance and constant victories were enticing the Muslims to worship him rather than God.
I understand that, but he has been probably one of the most important reasons, or not important reasons, probably one of the most, what's the word? He himself, Khalid, is probably, and if we were to do a pie chart of important individuals to the Rashidun Caliphate, when it comes to how much success they have achieved so far, at least half of it has to go to Khalid due to the battles, the structure, the integrity, the morale he brings to the troops, as well as the conquering he's been doing and his ability to win. He's a winner. So I think Omar is just a little bit too crazy on this one. Not crazy, but he's just a little bit too much into, like, have a conversation with the Khalid and then maybe don't just go off mob rule.
So when Umar received reports of his general's extravagance, Umar used it as an excuse to dismiss the Sword of Islam from his post and bring him to Medina. When the two formidable men came face to face, the Caliph spoke the words, "You have done, and no man has done as you have done, but it is not people who do, it is Allah who does." After this, Khalid left Arabia for Chalcis, where he lived just 4 more unhappy, unremarkable years before finally passing away in 642.
Sad way to go. He shouldn't have treated him so harshly.
As the undefeated victor of hundreds of clashes leaves our story, another bold but historically unappreciated Arab general enters the limelight. That was the 48-year-old Amr ibn Alas, who won distinction during the battles at Ajnadain, Yarmouk, and many others. When Abu Ubaidah appointed the conquered regions to his subordinates, Amr received all of Palestine. Upon moving into the area, he forced the surrender of Gaza and several other Roman garrisons which had remained unconquered after the fall of Jerusalem. In early 639, plague spread rapidly throughout the Levant. The Arabs, unaccustomed to this kind of terrible disease because of their nomadic lifestyle, died in the thousands, including generals Yazid, Shurabil, and Abu Ubaidah himself.
You would think that would be crippling enough to where the Romans could have charged through the Levant.
It is worth noting that upon Yazid's death, his younger brother Muawiyah was appointed as governor in his place. Amr, who survived, was given command of the army, and this gave him a golden opportunity to propose an idea to the Caliph. Having visited Alexandria multiple times earlier in his life, Amr was well aware of just how prosperous the Nile region was, and believed it would be easy to conquer. The new commander put forward his plan to seize Roman Egypt for Islam, confidently declaring to the Caliph, "It is the richest of lands and the weakest in defending itself." Although Umar, who wished to consolidate Muslim gains after years of incessant warfare and plague, was initially reluctant, believing Amr was underestimating the task, his eloquence and persistence eventually led the Caliph to relent.
Here we go.
Restricted to just 4,000 troops, mainly cavalry, Amr set forth from Jabia that same night in total secrecy, under the condition that he would withdraw if instructions to turn back reached him before he crossed into Egypt. However, if Amr's army was already inside Egypt when these instructions arrived, it could keep going. Convinced almost immediately that this expedition was too risky, Umar sent a camel rider off to Amr carrying a sealed letter ordering him to pull back. When it reached the general at Rafah, just a few miles from Egypt, Amr understood that the letter would doom his expedition before it even began. So Amr left the message unopened and moved into Egypt, and only then opened the letter. And since the army was already in Egypt when Umar's orders were revealed, Amr reasoned that it could keep going.
A little bit of lawyering right there by Umar, or yeah, or Amir. My bad, not Umar. A little bit of lawyering by Amir. I think he knew. He definitely knew what that letter was. He's seeking greatness right here. But let's see what happens.
The timeless province of power and riches was incredibly vulnerable, weakened by years of military laxity, and alienated from the imperial authorities in Constantinople by long-standing cultural and religious differences. The primary factor was that the Copts, Egypt's native population, adhered to a different form of Christianity to the empire at large. Emperor Heraclius in particular persecuted any perceived heretic in a manner that made religious division inevitable. The Roman authorities in Alexandria were alerted to Amar's presence, responding by raising troops and sending some of them to reinforce Pelusium, the key to Egypt. Setting forth from Arish in late December 639, the Caliphate's small army of veterans soon reached Pelusium, besieging it by land. However, Roman naval superiority meant that the city garrison could be reinforced and supplied, and this led to a 2-month-long siege, which was only brought to a conclusion when the Muslims repulsed a sortie and stormed the city in mid-February 640.
We saw this in 1100 years later in when Napoleon tried to besiege Acre, or Acre, however you want to pronounce it. The British had naval superiority in the Mediterranean, giving the, I believe it was the Ottomans, perfect time, or an amazing amount of time to continue to resupply, and they could have been besieged for a year and it would have made a difference. I guess in this case, urgencies took over. Of course, the Navy's not anywhere near the same as it would have been in 1799. However, they got it.
After taking Pelusium, to the alarm and astonishment of the government in Alexandria, Amr marched unopposed along the Nile Delta's eastern fringe until he reached the citadel of Bilbais. The defenders resisted under blockade for a month, giving the Romans time to shift their forces around. Aware that the marauding 4,000 Arabs were aiming for the Memphis area, Egypt's prefect and patriarch of Alexandria, Cyrus, marched a 20,000-strong army to reinforce the nearby fortress called Babylon. Commanded by Augustalis Theodorus and garrisoned by 5,000 soldiers, Babylon was one of the Nile's strongest defensive bastions, standing 60 feet high in places and possessing walls up to 6 feet thick.
I don't know how they're going to get through that. I mean, that is just formidable. And it's to the back of the river. I mean, the river's not going to be too much of a play here. I wouldn't guess. However, I don't know. This is going to be a difficult one for the Muslims.
By the time Amr starved the Bilbais defenders into surrender in the spring of 640, the Romans were prepared for his inevitable assault. Bypassing Heliopolis on their left, the Muslims arrived outside Babylon in May. Due to its sheer size, only some of Theodorus's army were manning the battlements, while most were encamped outside of the northern wall of the fortress, protected by a deep arcing ditch.
These ditches are so common, it seems, outside of these structures. I'm guessing that's more or less a tactic, a defensive tactic of the time. They're 0 for 2 so far using these tactics. Well, not technically 0 for 2 because the last one they kind of came out and then they lost versus a attack. So will they do the same thing as they did last time, which is besiege or bait the enemy to come out and then facing them on solid ground? Let's see.
Fortifying this secondary position even further were spikes in front and undug sections around the perimeter to act as sally points. Shortly after arriving and witnessing the Roman strength arrayed inside Babylon, Amr launched his 4,000 against the Roman units directly in front of the trench. After a hard-fought skirmish, the Muslims were repulsed with relative ease and set about finally making camp. Observing that his plan to keep Theodorus on the defensive was paying off, Amr mounted daily raids against the Roman positions all along the ditch. Furthermore, in an attempt to conceal just how tiny his forces were, the Muslim commander split and spread it over a large area. This state of affairs lasted for 2 months, the Muslims constantly assailing the Roman positions, and the Romans remaining hunkered down behind the ditch, presumably believing they would be able to win without fighting.
Is Scutatoy, like, is this like a specialist, almost like a hoplite?
By July, no opportunity to gain a decisive victory had shown itself to Amr, and his men were slowly tiring. So, having put the eventuality to the back of his mind, the man who had proclaimed that taking Egypt would be simple wrote to the Caliph asking for reinforcements. Rather than chiding his overly optimistic general, Umar mustered and sent him 4,000 reinforcements to conclude the campaign, who reached Amr a few weeks later. With these new forces, the Muslim attacks on Babylon were renewed with even greater force, killing large numbers of Roman soldiers, but failing to break the bastion's resistance. Even more hesitantly than the first time, Amr sent another request for Umar's aid. This time a further 4,000 troops were dispatched under the leadership of Zubayr bin al-Awwam, who, despite being offered Amr's command by the irritated Caliph, merely stated that he wished to help the Muslims engaged in Egypt.
He was almost offered command. That's a little snaky by Umar.
These new troops arrived in late September. After conducting a personal reconnaissance mission around the area, Zubayr pointed out something to Amr which the general seems to have missed. Still present about 10 miles behind the Muslim army was the Roman garrisoned city of Heliopolis. If coordinated correctly, these troops could smash into the Muslims from behind if Theodorus launched any attack from Babylon. To remove this potential threat, Amr led a large portion of his 12,000 soldiers to Heliopolis, leaving just enough at the fortress to keep the Romans on their toes. Upon approaching the walls, however, some of the garrison's cavalry contingent emerged from the city and beat some of Amr's horsemen in a brief engagement. Nevertheless, they were forced to pull back inside the walls as the city was besieged. Only a short time after investing Heliopolis, Zubayr and a small unit of hand-picked warriors scaled the walls in a dashing maneuver and breached the city. Seeing this, and realizing that the result of the clash was inevitable anyway, Heliopolis' garrison sued for peace and paid the jizya, after which Amr and Zubayr returned to Babylon. In their absence, the Romans had driven away the Muslim detachments closest to the trench and re-established their positions beyond it. Theodorus, likely realizing that he wasn't going to have the luxury of simply waiting the invaders out, began employing the Muslims' own tactics against them, launching daily raids through the Roman bridgeheads. Although the Romans generally lost more men in these scattered engagements, they could afford to, while Amr could not. The stalemate went on relatively unchanged until a revered Arab
I've been calling him Amir, it's Amr.
officer, Kharija bin Huzafa, approached Amr with a risky but potentially decisive plan to win the battle. That night, Kharija was given a cavalry regiment and ordered to lay his trap, which he did by riding around to the southern spur of a featureless ridge on the eastern side of the field. After quietly taking up a concealed position relatively close to the Romans' ditch, the Muslim cavalry waited. As Huzafa suspected, when morning came, the Roman forces crossed the trench in force and deployed for battle.
The Khalid used to do this too, so it's not just... So this is like a traditional ambush attack right here.
The Muslims arrayed opposite them. When both sides were ready, Theodorus launched his attack across the front, pushing Ammar, who ordered his army to retreat from Babylon with suspicious ease. It was in reality a feigned retreat. When the melee had moved far beyond Babylon's defensive trench, Carriger's mounted contingent galloped out from their hiding place behind the ridge and occupied the crossing areas which Theodorus would have to use for any retreat. Ammar, seeing that his horsemen were in place, countercharged with immense ferocity, driving the Romans back towards their own fortifications. Hearing the given signal, Carriger also launched his assault, crashing straight into Theodorus's rear, hemming the Romans in and then encircling them. Many defenders were killed, but a few Roman units turned and burst through Huzaffa's cavalry, managing to re-secure the crossing points.
How did y'all let him get through?
The remnants of the Roman army at Babylon retreated across the trench, pursued closely by Ammar's forces, who continued their attack up to the very walls of the fortress. Fighting continued in the space between the ditch and the citadel proper, until the gate was closed from inside. Those who got in were the lucky ones, as not a single Roman soldier remained alive on the field of battle. The morale of Cyrus, who was not a military man by profession, and the Roman soldiery as a whole, was completely shaken by this stark defeat, and to the prefect, it was clear that peace had to be concluded. To make matters even more dire, Ammar somehow got his hands on a few catapults and used them to launch deadly boulders, softening up the defenses. When this began happening, Cyrus departed Babylon with a small escort and took up residence on the mid-river island of Rauda, from which the fortress was being resupplied. Then the Coptic prefect dejectedly sent word to the Muslims that he wished to treat with them. Envoys were exchanged back and forth between the two sides, and Heraclius's viceroy attempted to offer Ammar a lavish bribe if the Muslims left Egypt, but the Arab commander responded by giving three options: conversion to Islam, payment of the jizya, or death.
It's always those three.
Cyrus favored capitulating in some form, but his Egyptian colleagues wouldn't have any of it, so the stalemate continued outside the impenetrable fortress. Since coming to terms with Cyrus was impossible, Ammar went into Babylon with a few companions in order to speak with Theodorus. However, when he was entering the fortress, a Roman soldier muttered to him scornfully, "You have entered, now see how you get out." Correctly believing orders had been given for him to be killed upon exiting the conference, Ammar tricked his way out of the fortress, convincing Theodorus that he was going to bring even more of his generals unwittingly into the trap. These attempts at ending the siege failed, and the gridlock outside Babylon continued. But finally, in mid-December, the observant Zubeir noticed that since most of the fighting had taken place on Babylon's north side, the riverside Gate of Iron and its two guard towers were relatively undefended. Just like that, the Muslims had found a key to Theodorus's citadel. Swiftly putting his infiltration plan into action with
They got over there pretty quickly.
Ammar's blessing, Zubeir assembled a unit to conduct the operation. On the moonless, clear night of December 20th, 640,
That means it's very dark.
most of the Muslim army arrayed quietly outside the Gate of Iron, while Zubeir and his comrades climbed ladders up the wall. Then, when some of his men were gathered on top, a deafening Islamic battle cry was sounded, echoed by the entire army, causing shock and panic amongst defenders who had no idea what was happening. Amidst the chaos, Zubeir slew the gatehouse sentries and broke the chain which held the gate closed, allowing Ammar and the Muslim army to flood inside.
It's over.
While some of the more elite Roman formations made a brave last stand, most of their comrades routed towards the Nile. Once they reached the riverbank, the soldiers crossed to the safety of Rauda on pre-prepared boats, which ferried soldiers back and forth throughout the night.
That was the escape plan the whole time. They knew something like this was going to happen.
Among those who fled was Theodorus, who managed to escape Amma's grasp and run back to Alexandria. The next day, Cyrus sued for and obtained peace for the Copts on Muslim terms, agreeing to pay the jizya and submit the entire country to Islamic rule.
Beautiful. Beautiful. As you guys know. That's where we're going to stop today. I think that this was an interesting episode. Khalid is no longer with us. I mean, he's with us during this time frame. He's just retired, technically. Amr, it's kind of like the new star of the show. They've taken Babylon, which is across the stream, or the Nile, from Giza. Now you got Cyrus basically in a very difficult position, so that's where we'll pick up next time. Syria and Iraq is pretty much conquered at this point. There's not much Eastern expansionism happening currently past what they've already gotten. And now look, they're taking Egypt slowly but surely. That's going to be it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave a comment, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. We got a lot more early Muslim expansion to go. Also leave some video recommendations down below for after this series is over. I'll be sure to read every comment. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.